Very happy to have Erik Hurst speak to us today about, I don't know how you kept these titles, it's terrific. A theory of how workers keep up with inflation.
We can talk after the end to see if that's the right title, but I think it's the right.
Okay, well, I like them all therefore. Anyway, welcome to be here. You have a big crowd, a lot of interest, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've been here 3 weeks. I'm here through next Tuesday morning, so it's great to be here. So here's what I've been thinking about. So what you're seeing here is Jeuck's data on the vacancy to unemployment rate from early 2001 through, I think I stopped this picture somewhere mid 2024. And what you can see is the vacancy to unemployment rate increased sharply, basically starting in the mid-teens, but really spiked 22 and 23 in the United States. And this vacancy to unemployment rate has been interpreted that the labor market was pretty strong during this period, where the vacancies are kind of the postings of the firms that they want to hire. The unemployment rate is kind of the supply of labor, and people have interpreted that the demand for hiring was large relative to the supply of workers. And that has showed up both among academics and policymakers as a kind of a conjecture that the labor market was pretty hot during this time period. Chair Powell has actually talked about this multiple times on reasons that they might have delayed cutting interest rates, keeping interest rates high because the labor market was still hot. And then the belief is that the hot labor market would put upward pressure on wages and feed into inflationary expectations. Simultaneously, real wages were falling pretty sharply during this period. And so what I'm showing you here now is from the Atlanta Fed index on average, and this is median, real wages in the United States. I'll show you the whole distribution in a couple more slides. Using data from the CPS, and for those who are unfamiliar with the Atlanta Fed, they're just taking CPS data, tracking an individual over time, looking at Steve's wage today, Steve's wage 1 year later, see how Steve's wages evolved, and then computing that for the distribution over time. And during this period, real wages are still, this is again through July of 2024, about 4.5%, where they should have been based upon trend in the pre-period. And we could talk about what the trend is. Here is a trend from 2016 to 2019, just kind of extrapolate. We could talk about what the right trend is. But the key thing is real wages were falling during this period, still below some trend. And this isn't often associated with a hot labor market. Think about highlighting high vacancy to unemployment rate and a period with declining real wages. And that's what this paper is going to be about. And so we're going to show both theoretically and empirically that the causation in kind of a modern macro model with a couple of realistic features, that the inflation itself can cause churn in the labor market, putting upward pressure on vacancies caused by real wages falling within a match. And so that's what this paper is going to be about. And we're going to kind of show a burst of inflation. Again, where does inflation come from? We'll talk about that as we go through. But all else equal could generate a sharp rise in the vacancy to employment rate, again, through this churn in a period resulting from a decline in real wages. John, talk to me, because there's going to be lots of things you're going to say I'm going to probably get to. But tell me something now.
Sure.
Okay.
How much of that is just inflation and existing wages versus wages of new hires?
Yes, that's going to be when you go through. The new hire wages do seem to be moving more. I'm going to show you wage movements. So let me kind of tell you the kind of things that I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of show you a preview of results real quick. I'm going to then show you just some data on the labor market along a variety of dimensions, not just these two that I showed you. One of those is going to be the wage changes of job switchers relative to stayers, and we can talk about some of that. That data, I'm going to then set up and say, can we generate that patterns, both qualitatively and quantitatively, in a model I'm going to write down? I'm going to show you that. And then I'm going to end by saying, well, what are other things that might have been going on during those period? And how do those other things match these patterns that are going on? And then we'll end with, well, then where did the inflation come from? So that's going to be the kind of the game plan that we're going to do. But the first part of the talk is I'm going to then kind of show you some patterns, but I want to really going to get down a theory and kind of say, what is the implications of that theory when inflation comes along in a modern macro model with some realistic features? And I'm just going to trace out those implications. And then we'll talk quantitatively stuff after that. Okay, so let me just give you a quick preview of the findings so you can kind of know where we're going to end up, and then we'll get into the meat of the talk. And I'm going to show you that a temporary increase in inflation can cause a rise in the vacancy to unemployment rate, creating the appearance of a tight labor market without any other underlying shock. Just the inflation itself could do that. And the key is there's going to be nominal rigidities on a match. As the nominal rigidity on a match comes up, the inflation erodes your wages, and workers are going to take actions to escape that wage. Now, in the model, as John already forecast, your outside option might be new hires or unemployment. How sticky are those wages is going to be a key parameter in the background of kind of the model. Now, how is that going to create vacancies through the lens of a model? The existing firms are going to post vacancies to replace the departing workers. But more importantly, when there's lots of people switching, it's cheaper for firms to hire a worker, all else equal, because they can match with a worker quicker. And so you're going to get this burst in vacancy creation as a result of this. A lot of it's just going to be churn of like musical chairs in the labor market. Ellen comes to Chicago, I go to Minnesota, and there's no really change in the underlying unemployment rate from this. So you're going to get a rise in churn, a rise in vacancies without any underlying change in the unemployment rate. And then I'm going to show you calibrating the data using pre-2000s data, shock with the inflation we observed, and I'm going to show you a quantitatively and qualitatively matches a lot of the patterns I'm going to start motivating in a few slides, both in the aggregate and the cross-section, because there's going to be a distributional part of this plot.
So this is consistent with a story that firms post in this recent period. They've posted vacancies even when they didn't really have the position, just in expectation.
Yeah, all of that would be consistent with all of that. Exactly. And I'll show you that come through as we go through. Once we get the model up, you'll see kind of what the firms are going to be doing. Yeah, how do we get it?
In the 1990s, unions had cost of living adjustments. And they got rid of those in the early 2000s. And as a result, now you're getting a lot of strikes with workers trying to catch up for inflation.
Yes.
Is that embedded in the model, or do you
have the strikes in the background? But let me tell you on my fourth point, I'm going to give you two other things first to kind of tell you what I'm going to do. And then the fourth point is going to be related to workers are going to hate this. And it's going to give us some rationale to understand what has been going on with workers in the labor market in the recent period. But yeah, and
expectation of inflation have to be high for a long period of time. Do they have to?
In the model, the expectation process is going to be important. And you'll see that once we get the model. So I'm going to defer that once we get to actually quantifying the model. We're going to have to take a stance on some of those things. I'm going to show you the model first, but on this question, it's going to be exactly, it's going to be a parameter. The persistence of inflation is going to be an important to turn some of these things. So the second thing, and this is my favorite part of the paper, I'm going to then explore historical data. I'm going to get to this towards the end, and I'm going to show that in prior periods of inflation in the past, like 1951, related to the periods that right after Valerie's sample ended from her talk last night, 1974, 1979, you saw again a very large spike in the vacancy to unemployment rate in a period where the labor market looked weak or not particularly strong on other dimensions. And I'm going to show you that inflation systematically seems to be a shifter of the beverage curve, the relationship between the vacancy to unemployment rate and unemployment using historical data over time. I'm going to end with the last thing I'm going to say is that other stories that are out there, working from home, sectoral reallocation, productivity shocks, traditional demand shocks, are going to struggle to match collectively many of these pieces of the data. The real wage decline is going to be one key component of that, but there's going to be lots of other metrics that these other types of shocks are going to fail on. And then the last one, and this is what I'm going to do in the middle part of the paper, I'm going to provide a model-driven reason why workers dislike inflation, with the only other friction being in the model, nominal wage stickiness on a match. And then I'm going to show you that the recent inflation reduced welfare of workers by about, we'll call it 1 month's wage. Okay, a little bit less at the bottom, a little bit more at the top. And then I'm going to decompose where those welfare gain losses are going to be coming from. Some of it's just the real wage erosion itself, but workers are going to then take these costly actions to help escape these nominal wage rigidities. So we got to keep into account the search costs, and I'm going to call this other thing a renegotiation cost when we get into the model. But there's also going to be gains that are going to be around there as well, because firms are going to be moving workers away from the layoff margin because they're relatively cheap, and so you're going to get some gains from reduced layoffs through the lens of the model. And so I'll be able to quantify each of these components going forward.
It's surprising, right, that labor contracts aren't indexed. I mean, you would imagine.
In some countries they are, when inflation is a lot more common. And so then we're going to have to think about, once we get to the model, how permanent this is. There's going to be a parameter in the model that might adjust into the indexing endogenously. And I'll show you that once we get into the model details.
And they may be again. Well, another thing people have talked about here is differences between workers. A dean once said inflation is the dean's best friend, because the people who move are the better workers, and the people who don't are the not so good workers. So in some sense, it's wages start shifting to marginal product, but people collecting on old promises get screwed. Is that?
I mean, you're going to have some of that in the model. We're going to have some dimensions of heterogeneity. We're going to have some productivity level. The different parts of the distribution are going to naturally churn a little bit more than others. So the old embedded professors, we don't move too much. And so the costs on us are going to be more because we're not going to be able to easily escape the real wages. So you're going to get some wage compression during this period. Everybody's wages are worse off, but the bottom is going to be less off worse than the top through the lens of the model. And that'll be a lot easier once we get the model on the table, so you can see kind of
the story about inflation being the manager's best friend is about downward nominal stickiness. You've got upward nominal stickiness here too.
Yes, and so the model is going to be asymmetric, so you could then put in different shocks within the model.
This is very different from some Keynesian stories that would emphasize downward nominal rigidity and upward flexibility.
But there's still the intuition from John's comment is still going to be there that firms are making lots of profits during this period. So I'll show you. You're going to get firm profits going up, and then and in the data we see historically high firm profits in the same period as well. And we saw those high profits in 1974, conditional on the state of the economy. We saw the high profits in 1951, conditional on the state of the economy. So we are transferring resources during this period. The real wage rigidity is a transfer from the workers to the firms during this time period.
As John's story, you wouldn't get the labor churn, right? Because people that are productive, they would just renegotiate the current
employer. So both of those margins, and so both of those things are going to be trade-off for different types.
Because they wouldn't have a chance.
You need a story that they can't raise your salary without raising my salary. So you got to go get a job to raise.
Well, but then you have the upward rigidity too.
We'll see that once we get in the model, we can have this discussion a little bit more. Let me just kind of summarize the three big takeaways. And then go to data.
So why do you ever, in this world, like why do you have rigid contracts at all with labor?
Yeah, why nominal wage rigidity is there? There is, contracting frictions in the world. Like once we get into the model, there is contracting frictions in the world. And once I show you kind of what we're going to assume, then we can talk about the realism of those. And I'm going to show you data that's going to help us discipline kind of this component of the real world. Yeah.
I mean, one way to think about it is every time you're bargaining in the labor market, adding another state variable is costly in terms of the amount of time you have to bargain. And it's actually a testament to the previous success of the Federal Reserve at staying close to the 2% target, that they took these out of the contracts. And then that's why it was so shocking to have the high inflation afterwards.
Yeah. But if it was permanent, then maybe our contracting rules would change. Back to Anna's question going onwards, and that's going to be, you'll see that when that comes into the model when we come through. Okay, so there's the high level stuff. Policymakers and academics should be cautious about viewing the rise in the vacancy to unemployment rate as a sign of a hot labor market during inflationary periods without looking at other moments of the data. The high additional real costs of inflation that arise through, highlight the additional real cost of inflation through the labor market. Again, these search costs and renegotiation costs are going to be things maybe our models want to take into account. and it's going to provide, and I think many of you are already moving in this direction, a model-based reason why workers report disliking inflation so much during the recent period. It shows up in surveys, it shows up in post-election results. There's a whole many types of moments where workers were seen to be very dissatisfied with this labor market in recent periods. I'm now going to show you a handful of data just from public sources to kind of get some additional moments on the table that we might want theories to potentially explain during this period. I'm going to show you a series of pictures like this. All of them start in 2016, January, and they all run through mid to late 2024, depending upon the picture I'm going to be showing you. The shaded years is what I'm going to call the inflation period. That's going to run from April 2021 through May 2023. And it's any time in the US, just by a rule, that the inflation rate was above 3.5%. So that is a period where it crossed 3.5% and then came back down under 3.5%. There's going to be two lines on these figures. One, which is going to be the average of the data from 2016 to 2019, pre-pandemic. I'm going to throw out, 2020 and early 2021 in all my analysis. So the pre-pandemic trend, and then the trend during the inflationary period. The first pictures I'm showing you are just from JOLTS. There was a huge decline in a historical sense in the layoff margin during this period, where the layoff margin has declined by about 20% relative to the 2016 to 2019 period. We see a big movement in the quit rate during this period. Many of us in this room have been talking about the quit rate in various different types of models. The quit rate was elevated. It's coming back down towards a trend in recent periods, and the vacancy rate jumped and is still coming back towards trend, but still elevated relative to the 2016 to 19 period.
Think about the total labor force that shrink.
Yeah, I'm going to show you two slides, Harold. Exactly. So Harold's already going to be, after this one, I'm going to show you a labor force side going through from these two periods. So this is going to be the worker side.
Sorry, the last point about it in all industries.
Oh, I forgot to mention that, yes.
So I would have thought there'd be some industries that were stickier wages and they would have a bigger increase in the vacancy rate.
Yeah, I think, but as we talked about earlier, those manufacturing kind of things, those indexing unionized contracts have gotten less and less components during this period. So the vacancy rate did move sharply in all industries. So the vacancy rate on average increased by about 50% if you take that 4 to a 6. All industries from the JOLTS ranged from about 40% increase in vacancies to about 80 in most indices, except non-durable manufacturing. That jumped by about 100% in the vacancies. So almost all it had substantial increases. There is variation across the industries, but to a first order, every industry had one of these big increases. When we start thinking maybe stories of sectoral reallocation, we should keep this in mind. These are patterns are relatively broad-based. This is the worker side flow of those analysis. So now this is from CPS data, and I'm going to measure job-to-job flows in the CPS and unemployment to employment flows in the CPS. You could see that in the period when the quits were running high, there was a lot of E to E flows occurring in the data. There hasn't been much at all change in the U to E margin during this time period. So it's the churn is coming, or at least the looking of the hot labor market is coming in churn, not so much in changing the propensity for those unemployed to enter into the labor force. And again, these occur for all groups of people, but there is more churn during this period, even relative to the pre-period, at the bottom of the distribution relative to the top. The top churns, the bottom churns more. This is Harold's question on just trends in the employment rate in the pre-period and the inflation period. Nothing changed on average. So there wasn't a big change in the unemployment rate. There wasn't a big change in the employment rate compared to the 2016-19 in the inflation period during this thing. You get a little bit for women with a bachelor's degree or more, but that's part of a secular trend if you even take that out, 20 years prior. But all other groups were relatively constant. But let me show you.
I mean, it's a small point, but people did get older in this period, and pre-pandemic projections were that the employment rates would be falling for many of these groups because just retirement.
Yeah.
So
And again, I should be fair. I'm showing this picture for 2020, 25 to 55. It might make better because then the flows are going to be, maybe the flows are going to be, you know, for the whole economy from the firm side. Maybe I should think about the, you know, doing it for the whole group.
Because there was a lot of retirement,
Yeah.
you know, around COVID.
Yeah, but that's in the COVID period. So now this is, again, we're now thinking about the inflation period per se, because all of these patterns really were peaking in 2022, and the employment rate and the unemployment rate were back, but there are these
You've got
secular
the
trends.
prime age
Yep.
restriction, so that largely addresses.
Yeah, but I think your point is maybe I shouldn't have the prime age in this one. Let's take a look at the total thing. I should at least look at that. This is just prime age. Let me show you now from the Atlanta Fed data, just the distribution of wage changes at the top and the bottom of the distribution. And it's monotonic for the other quartiles, so I didn't even show you those. You can see those in the paper. But the bottom of the wage distribution is about 2.5% below trend, where the top is about 7% below trend in terms of this period. So everybody's below trend, but there is wage compression during this period. And there has been some papers. David Auder has some kind of things about wage compression during this period. He's talking about a hot labor market because he's looking in nominal kind of sense. But in real terms, everybody's wages are going down, but they do go down less at the bottom than they do at the top. This is wage rate. This is wage rate right from the CPA. This is, yeah, so this is basically hourly earnings if you're hourly, and it's weekly earnings divided by usual weekly hours if you're salary. Yeah.
Price index using the rate.
I'm using the CPI for everybody. So, and again, if there's differences across groups, that's outside my model, and you should adjust all of that by this.
There's still a lot of bias. Over 5 or 6 years. So.
Again, that will affect levels, but not the distribution and kind of component, unless people are, you want to deflate by different people. Yeah, John.
Right, so like, I get a picture that, you know, the old established tenured professors take a hit, the young assistant professors are moving on anyway, they don't. That, it's not really about where your wages are, it's about where you are in labor.
Yeah, it's about the churn. I mean, so, and I'm going to show you there's going to be some links between your wage and the churn, but John's already got the model mechanism that's going to come up, that's going to come out of this. Different parts of different distribution are going to have different propensities to churn, and that's what's going to drive these patterns in our model. So we're going to be able to match that through that mechanism that John just outlaid. Okay, let me show you one last one, because there's again another moment that we want the data to potentially match. What I'm showing here is ADP data just from their website. They've kind of taken the stuff that me and John Grigsby did in our AER piece, and now they've kind of putting it out on their webpage for everybody to see. This is the average nominal, I haven't deflated these, nominal wage of job changers, the top line, and job stayers, the blue line. And that initial period gap is kind of what John and I got from 2008 to 2016 average. You know, the job stayers kind of change about 2%. The job stayers about 2%. The job changers about 6%. About a 4% gap. That gap exacerbated greatly during the recession. So the wage change of job changers increased disproportionately more than the wage change of job stayers during this period, and it's kind of moving back towards pre-periods late into the period. Again, you get very similar patterns from the Atlanta Fed data as well. So a lot of the wage growth is coming from job changers. That always happens, but even disproportionately more.
Both rate, or is it both rate from?
It is like an individual fixed effect of workers. So it's Harold's wage growth.
What does 16% mean? It means that from I don't know.
1 year over year. Sorry, year over year change. I'm sorry, Harold. Everything's year over year change. So this is annualized growth of wage change for job changers.
And say similar patterns in the wage tracker, you mean just for job stayers?
For job changer and job stayers, if the gap doubled, the levels are going to be
tracker just follows stayers, right?
Notifiers changers who stay in the same house. If you go to the Atlanta Fed now, you could click on a button and there'll be exactly that picture. But Steve's point, the magnitudes are a little because a lot of the job changers get missed from the CPS, particularly those who move house, and those tend to be more selected. And so you see the same patterns muted in the Atlanta Fed, relative to the ADP data. And that's why I'm showing you this one. Okay, the background of models that we have during this period. Here's some data that we might want to match. E to E transitions increase sharply, not much in the U to E rate. Real wages fall sharply, have been catching up slowly, disproportionately declines at the top relative to the bottom. Real wages of job changers increased much more relative to trend compared to job stayers. And vacancies increased sharply, but unemployment was relatively constant. We're getting kind of shifts in the beverage curve during this period. So that's kind of the background. Now I'm going to come and just kind of play with the model for a little bit. We could write down these assumptions that all of you wanted to kind of get to, and we'll kind of formalize kind of those assumptions. And then we'll play quantitatively afterward, and we'll see, the quantitatively is going to more proof of concept on some dimensions. We'll at least get understanding the mechanism of the model that we want to cover.
So Eric,
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're not gonna have this in the model, which is that suppose there's some workers who are a bad match and the firm doesn't feel like it could cut their nominal wage. Back to Steve's comment. It might be good reallocation from a productivity point of view for the firm to get rid of them rather than offer them higher wages.
Yes, in one dimension. So if the workers' productivity attrits over time, let me kind of show you what that's going to be in the model. Once I show you the model, we can kind of see what's missing, but we're going to have a force for that. We don't have any reallocative effects of churn in our model, but we are going to have worker types sometimes being bad, workers wanting to be fired, the firm's wanting to fire them or cut their wages, but because of nominal rigidities, they might fire them. We're going to have those mechanisms, and that's going to be when the layoff margin is going to be moving. That's going to be some benefits to the economy from that. So we're going to have some of that, but to Pete's point, I'm not going to have any sort of match specific, fit between workers. I'll show you the production. It'll be easier once I show you the production function, but we're going to have some of the essence of Pete's comment in the model. So let me kind of show you the model, and then we can talk about what it might be missing after that. Okay, so we're going to have a model of labor market flows. It's going to be relatively standard with two additional frictions. The first is going to be, there's going to be frictions in nominal wage adjustments on a match. Okay, it's going to look, I'm going to show you when we specify, it's going to have a Calvo and menu cost flavor from New Keynesian models. I'm going to have both aspects in there, and I'll show you why I need both aspects into our regular search and labor matching models. The second component we're going to have is there's going to be a lack of commitment on the part of workers and firms. So you're sometimes going to get, because of these nominal wage rigidities, some inefficient transitions. Some workers are going to be fired, and some workers are going to quit. Not everything will be renegotiated on the match. We're going to have endogenous worker flows in the sense that workers are going to be able to quit to unemployment. Firms are going to be able to lay off workers, and you're going to have job to flows. I'm going to have some exogenous shocks in the model that are also going to exogenously attrit workers. We're going to have, I already told you, these frictions are going to apply that some of these flows are going to be inefficient. There's going to be heterogeneity in worker type across the model. They're going to differ in a bunch of dimensions, which I will specify as we go along. There's no heterogeneity on the employer side. So there's just going to be homogeneous firms in the background. I'm going to tell you the game I'm going to play, and then we'll come back and relax this afterwards. I'm going to have God just a changing the inflation rate as a shock in the background of the model. Okay, you could think about it as a monetary policy shock or something else going on. I'm not going to microfound any of that. We will talk about where the real inflation might have come at the end of the talk and how that might interact with some of the patterns. But right now, the game I'm going to play is just an exogenous change in the inflation rate and trace out how that's going to move on worker flows.
Maybe it was a devil changing inflation.
Oh, the double, yeah, it may not be the gut. It depends on your rate. Yeah, but yes. So the model could be anything. So once we get to the model, we could then trace out, as Anna said before, whether it's permanent, whether it's temporary, whether it occurs on a Tuesday all at once, or whether some of it's on a Wednesday and some of it's on a Thursday. All of that's going to be important.
With the institutional rigidities, do you include lags? For example, unions lose because they're stayers, but they make up for it in the second period.
So let me show you what I have, and then we'll come back and say what we could potentially add in addition to what I have. Let me kind of get to the guts of the model now. So now I'm going to kind of start to show you some notation and some equations to kind of formalize what I have, and then we can kind of see what is missing and what might be valuable to add for the questions that I'm trying to address. So time is going to be continuous. Workers are going to die, physically die, at an exogenous rate chi. They're just going to leave the labor market. Workers are only going to have two states at any period of time. They're going to either be employed or unemployed. I don't have a three-state model. There's not a home sector. So everybody's either searching or employed. We're going to have heterogeneous worker productivities. So all of us are going to be born with some initial, I'm going to call it level Z. Some of us are going to be high Z, some of us are going to be low Z. It's going to come from some log normal distribution at birth, and then it's going to evolve thereafter with some Brownian motion with drift. So some of our productivities are going to go up over time, some of our productivities are going to go down over time, and the drift differs between whether you're employed or unemployed. So for those of us employed, maybe our productivity is increasing on average over time. For those of us who are unemployed, maybe our productivity doesn't increase as much. Our production function is going to be very simple. The output from the firm, I'll just call X here, is just going to be an common aggregate productivity, AT, times the worker's productivity, ZIT. I'm going to normalize A to 1 in everything I show you. But when I do counterfactuals with productivity shocks later on to see if they can match the data, I'm going to shock that A thing up and down. In terms of notation, capital W tilde is going to be the nominal wage. Capital W is going to be the real wage, the nominal wage deflated by some price index P. That's what God is going to come and change. And there's going to be some markdown, which I'm going to call little w hat, which is going to be your log productivity minus your log wage. Where's that markdown going to come from? Everywhere in the standard search model, firms are going to have to recoup their job posting costs. So your wage is going to be a little bit lower than your productivity in the background. The nominal rigidities are also going to move this thing around.
Wait, so on average, your wage is lower than your productivity. You're going to have some workers whose
Because of
okay. I mean,
we're going to have a distribution of markdown.
From the facts that you showed before, don't we learn something about the distribution of that markdown or markup? I mean, it seems like when inflation happened, pretty much everybody took some real wage, which suggests that there might have been a lot of people out there whose wage was higher than their productivity.
It can't be too high because then the firm will fire you at some point. So you're going to be capped on how high your productivity is. So we hired Josh. Josh's productivity is going up somewhat. In this case, Josh's productivity is going up. His nominal wage is fixed. He's going to quit and go try to search at another firm or renegotiate with his existing firm. So there's going to be these endogenous quits, these endogenous fire. If Josh's productivity goes down too low, your markdown, is going to be limited because the firm's going to fire you at some point. So there's going to be a distributions of markdowns in the data, which is going to have some bounds because of these endogenous quits and fire. That's exactly the model we're going to build. Okay, let me tell you the other parts of the model. There's going to be a home sector in the background. For those who don't work, you're going to get some utility B. That utility B is going to potentially scale with your productivity Z in some arbitrary way, which I'm going to call phi B, which we're going to let the data tell us what it is. What is phi B? If phi B is less than 1, it means that lower productivity employed workers are going to be on average closer to their outside option. And so they're going to hate unemployment less than the high skilled worker. Phi B less than 1, I'm going to estimate from the data. So that's going to be the relevant case, but it could be anything. It could have been phi B greater than 1, which means we like the high productivity workers like unemployment more on average than the low productivity workers. That's going to be one form of heterogeneity in the background, John. That's going to help explain differential churn at different parts of the distribution across workers. We're going to have firms in the background. There's going to be directed search where firms are going to post some vacancies offering a real wage, and the real wage is going to be associated with a given productivity Z. So firms are going to post a vacancy and say, hey, this is the vacancy. If you come Z type, you're going to get this wage. The cost of posting a vacancy is going to be K or kappa. I forget what I'm using there. And it's also going to scale arbitrarily with your Z. It might be more expensive to hire more productive workers than it is to hire low productive workers on the part of the firm.
How is the incidence of their posting costs on? That's not obvious. Maybe it's standard.
I mean, there's going to be an equilibrium where firm is zero profit firm condition on terms of entry, that firms are then going to want to make sure that on average they're earning zero profits in expectation. And so that means the wage is going to have to be, the cost that they have to bear is going to be an equilibrium, have to be recouped somehow to get the zero profit. So that is standard in this kind of literature. I'm also going to estimate in the data later on that it's going to look like through this lens of the model, more expensive to hire high types than it is low types. So the phi K greater than 1 is what the data is going to spit out. And I'll show you how the data is going to spit it. What moments I'm going to infer this from in a few slides. I'm not going to talk much. Everything here is relatively standard. There's going to be a Cobb-Douglas matching function in the background where firms and workers are going to meet and match with some probability. The only two things I want to flag in the background, we're going to have a search function. Workers are going to spend some time searching. It's going to be utility cost. I'm going to specify that in the next slide formally, but it's going to be, the cost is going to be a function of both their productivity and the state. It might be more or less costly for unemployed workers to search on average than it is for employed workers, or vice versa. Valerie.
Hi. So you say you have an exogenous separation shock, but are there also endogenous separations?
The whole model is
Yeah,
endogenous.
that's what
So
I-
on
okay,
top
I
of it,
just wanted to make
so we're
sure.
going to then allow one more margin to help fit the data. There's also going to be some exogenous. God's going to also come down and just kill some matches from time to time. Everything else is going to be endogenous for exactly what my answer to Josh was before. So we're going to have both endogenous and exogenous flows in this model. So let me just summarize. The workers are going to differ in productivity. That difference in productivity is also going to imply differences in the value of non-employment, the way I've specified, differences in potentially the cost of posting a vacancy, potentially differences cost in search, and these exogenous separation rates we're also going to allow to differ by type. That is the heterogeneity on the worker side in the model. All of them are going to be functions of this one vector Z, your type, at any given point in time. So here's preferences, and I'm going to unfold this slowly over slides. So what are workers going to get utility over? They're going to use their wages to fund some consumption. Anytime they search, they're going to have to pay a utility cost of search. And if they so desire to renegotiate with their boss, as Harold said earlier on, they might have to pay a cost of that as well. I'm going to spend some time talking about that renegotiation cost in the next few slides. But this is going to be the way workers could escape their nominal rigidity. So they have these two margins. They could do costly search, or they could have some renegotiation. And I have to tell you a lot, and this is the guts of the model now, about what is allowed for free and what is coming with a cost as we go through the model. In order to do that, I'm going to show you, I'm going to have, I'm going to say a relatively complicated wage adjustment process, but I'm going to have a wage adjustment process with both a Calvo and a menu cost component. Why am I going to have both? I'm going to actually show you the data first, and then I'm going to kind of use the data to motivate why I'm putting in both of these forces through the model. And I think it'll be clear when I go through the next slides why I'm going to need both. But this is a figure from my paper with John Grigsby using the ADP data. And so this is going to be the year-over-year base wage changes for individuals in the economy. And for those unfamiliar, ADP is about 20% of the US labor force is in the ADP data. So this is 20% of the US population, relatively random. So we do a lot of work in this paper that say this matches well kind of the representation of the aggregate economy along the dimensions associated with wage adjustments. As we've seen, people have alluded to before, between 2008 and 2016, there's essentially no nominal wage cuts. It's not zero, but essentially nominal. It's about 1 or 2%. So there's going to be some asymmetry in the data, at least in terms of potential, in terms of costliness of wage adjustments. There's a huge spike at zero, a large mass of workers who kind of change between 0 and 2%, and then a drop off, and then some tail of adjustment after that. So the model of wage adjustment we're going to want is you're going to want to have basically hard to get zero, less than zero, a big spike at zero, a lot of mass between potentially 0 and 2 or 0 and 3%, and then some tail after that. So I'm going to have two forces that are going to help me match this kind of distribution. Let me tell you what those forces are, and then we can see why we need both, or quantitatively what they're doing as we go along. So here's the first part of the wage adjustment. So we're matched with a firm. On the match, nominal wages are fixed. A Calvo ferry comes down every once in a while and taps you on your head. And when the Calvo ferry taps you on your head, you get to adjust a part of your wage for free. Okay, you don't have to pay any sort of renegotiation cost or search cost. So your nominal wage is fixed until the Calvo ferry taps you on the head. When the Calvo ferry touches you on the head, I'm going to call that arrival rate of lambda, you could adjust your wage from anywhere between 0 and we'll call pi W bar for free, 2%, 3%, whatever it is. Now this could be, based on norms. This could change with the permanency of the shock. Right now, I'm just going to have it as a fixed number, but this is going to be what you can get for free from a nominal wage change. So when the Calvo fairy taps you on the head, your wage could change anywhere from 0 to 2%. If the Nash bargained wage is greater than 2%, or pi W, I'm going to set that to 2% in the model. If it's going to be greater than 2%, you're just going to get 2% for free. And then otherwise, if it's less than 0, you're just going to get 0. And if it's in the middle, you're just going to go to the Nash bargained outcome. Now, what this does is it gives you kind of a range of wage changes that you could just get in a normal Calvo component. So when Booth changed my wage in the middle of the recession, I got my usual 3% growth, despite the inflation rate being, much larger. What did I get the year before? I got like 3%. What did I get the year before that? 3%. So there was some part, except when Steve was dean, I got like 2%. But in normal, minus 2. it was at 0. So he could have gone
downward stickiness.
There's downward stickiness. And so, there is something about this is kind of representing the norms in kind of wage setting that we tend to see that kind of come through normal wage adjustment processes.
Because otherwise, with the cost for negotiation, you would expect negotiations to happen less often, but be larger. And that's not what it seems like the data shows.
Exactly. And so that's going to be the next part of where we're going to get is now there's going to be this renegotiation cost, which is going to come with more frequency when the nominal wages, when the inflation rate is higher, when nominal wages are falling.
Maybe you're going to see it, but there are lots of bits and pieces here, like this one, and that firms can fire and other things that it's not entirely clear to me which ones are really essential for the main.
Yeah, so I'm going to hopefully kind of when I get to the quantitative stuff, at least I could show you quantitatively what things are.
This one is that just there to get a little bit of a wage dispersion.
This is going to give you. This is going to reduce the. It's not only going to give you wages. It's going to reduce the cost of inflation during. And so in normal periods of time, the cost of inflation isn't that big. So when it's 3% or 2%. It's not really creating additional churn in the labor market. People know that they'll be able to do it. So what it's doing is giving you some wage adjustment for free when inflation comes. You could take this to 0, and then the cost of inflation becomes even greater during this period.
Would have just been to say wages go up to pi bar W for everyone, and rather than putting in the Calvo fairy and then wages during low inflation episodes, would just go up by regular inflation and also and by 9.
That would be great if that did it. If we saw that in the data, that would be. The data seems to reject that, and so that's why I said this is a quantitative point.
This is not
exactly
to match another feature of the data. Yeah.
And then the action is then going to also come in inflation periods through the second part. So in the second part, you get the Calvo fairy for free, in the first part, and then when inflation is high, now you're going to have to take some costly actions. And so churning is going to be one. We'll talk about that. But also, you might be able to walk into Steve's office when he was the dean and kind of say, I'm going to, start looking around, or I went out and got an offer someplace and maybe you want to match it. And I have to take some costly action, either with the capital in the dean's office or my search to bring them back an offer that allows us to do some renegotiation. And so what is that going to look like? The cost of renegotiation is going to be drawn with some distribution. That's going to allow me the cost that I'm going to have to pay. So some of us might be able to renegotiate for free, and others might have to renegotiate in a more costly sense. So now, if in a high inflation environment, you get your 3% for free, but if you want more than 3%, you're going to have to take a costly action with fee being the cost, or side, I forget which one that is, pitchfork being the cost that you're going to have to pay. Yeah, Paula.
So in the data, is it true that the people with low skills had, because, in some way we know that they catch up more and there were more vacancies there. Is it true that they were either at a disadvantage, they had more stickiness or?
They churned more. So churned more. So I didn't show you that. I should have had that in the thing. Yes, exactly. Yeah, so again, I'm going to calibrate the model in a pre-period, and they're going to be, because they churn more through the lens of the model, they get to basically, adjust easier, and that's how their wages keep up more than the top of the distribution.
So just to see perhaps some of the changes of your models, if there was no shock, there is no macro shock, and God doesn't change it, does your model
match some of the features of the data where, for example, we didn't have any monetary shocks?
We're going to calibrate to match all of those kind of periods in terms of the wage distribution and the worker flows. And so we're going to use the pre-periods worker flows and wage distributions to calibrate the model. So we are going to match that wage distribution or some parameterized version of that wage distribution and the worker flows by design. Okay, so I'm going to pick parameters to match that, and then I'm going to shock the inflation, see what the model predicts, and then I'm going to compare those predictions to what the data actually did. So the game I'm going to play is how well quantitatively does this calibrated model to match the wage distribution and flows in a pre-period actually match the wage distribution and flows after the inflation shock. Again, just a one caveat, Steve, already know, I've kind of shut down all the asymmetry in the paper. I just made sure there was no wage cuts in the kind of slides I'm doing. In the paper, we do allow for another distribution of pitchforks to occur if you want to cut the wages to match the 1% or 2% of wage decline. So in the paper, we're more precise than what I'm doing in the slides, just to provide it.
May not be within the norms of what is behavioral and accepted and what is a fairly shock and is accepted. But you have this whole cohort inflation expectations. So when you get shocks and what do I expect in terms of persistence of those shocks and permanent, it could be cohort dependent. Did I see inflation? Did I not see inflation? Is that not in this, but like, are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to Anna's question early on, the expectations of the inflation shocks are going to be immensely important in the paper. Now, the one thing you think about when the inflation shocks are going to be more and more permanent, you might want to endogenize that pi bar W, what you get for free. If we go to a scenario where steady state inflation rate is going to be like 10% forever, Harold said maybe we just get 10% for free, wherever as part of our bargaining contract.
I'm thinking more about cohorts are more.
I don't have cohorts in the model. So it's basically just everybody is going to be a steady state on there. So I don't have that cohort part.
Decision to become educated.
Exactly.
Very much a function of that.
Exactly.
Stefan and
those kind of things. And again, the more you want to do permanent shocks, I think the more these things become interesting. In this period, financial markets at least thought they were going to be temporary. Workers thought they might be temporary. I'm going to use temporary shocks to actually just, as our baseline that I'm going to use to evaluate the model quantitatively. But I'll talk
in the fact, but it was temporary.
Yeah, they did too. No, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, so, okay, so let me kind of summarize the rigidities. And I think John hit one of these early on. I just want to formalize it. What I'm going to do in the paper right now is the new higher wage is going to be perfectly flexible. And there is some evidence that they are more flexible. The key part is the qualitative predictions of our model will go through as long as new higher wages are slightly more flexible than existing matches. But the quantitative stuff I'm going to do, I am going to assume that new higher wages are perfectly flexible. And I'm also going to assume the value of the home sector is also in real terms. The value of leisure is going to be, if that's a big part of not working, is going to be in real and not in nominal terms. That second one really just affects the UE margin, not so much the EDE flow. Okay.
So,
yeah.
Are you done with the model?
I'm done with the model.
So you didn't talk about the budget constraint. You didn't talk about assets, transfers, or any of these things. Are they going to play any role?
There is a budget constraint. So the C that is going to be in the model is going to be based upon your permanent income. You're going to forecast what your costs are going to be. So I should have put the budget constraint after this, but there is a budget constraint that is going to be bound by the households that are going to fund their consumption in each period. The workers are going to be forward looking. So it's going to basically going to have some.
Save,
yep, they could save.
Gives them transfers.
Yep.
Everything adds up.
There's no government in this model, so I don't have to worry about the government adding up in this model. But for the household things, they can save in terms of some of their shocks into consumption smoothing. All of that's going to be orthogonal to the unexpected inflation reducing real wages, and that's going to be the shock that's going to come through. Yeah, it's an MIT shock. I should have said that.
It's a immense and nasty model.
Yes.
Value dynamic, but
yes.
the value function.
You want to see the value functions?
Well, kind of hoping for the Minnesota definition of equilibrium.
Yeah, I have all of those slides. I'm going to try to. I'm trying to make sure I do that, but I'm just going to give John a preview of some of the things that I want to do a few more things, and we could just take a look at some of the value function of the employed worker that's going to be in the background. I think we could talk about some of that after, because all of that is going to be relatively standard in the points. I'm not going to do that right now because in the last 10 or 15 minutes, I do want to show you a couple of results. But if anybody wants to stay afterwards, we could go through the value functions. We could go through.
And then you solved it by some.
Yeah, the solving is Andres and Andres solved it. And, there's going to be a large amount of state spaces with a bunch of bounds where these layoff margins going to be. There's going to be quits to unemployment thresholds. The inflation is going to move these kind of boundaries around. So we're going to have this kind of mapping of a set of decisions of firms and a set of decisions of workers that are going to be simultaneously having to be solved. That is a complicated problem beyond my skill set. But Andres and Andres have worked, as I say, they had to kind of get that. But that is going to be around the background. I would love to talk about that afterwards, kind of the mechanics of the model, because I do think there is some innovation in the modeling aspect to solve models with this kind of distribution that is going on in the background that is in addition to kind of some of the results that I want to talk about.
It wasn't easy. You make me feel better and not as dumb as I was.
No, it is quite complex. And again, I was trying to think of how to do an hour talk. That was what I cut in the hour talk to try to give a flavor of the mechanisms, but there is a lot of meat underneath in terms of decision rules and firms in background.
In terms of the assets, there's no insurance against idiosyncratic risk. Is that right? So when they
exactly, I mean, so there's no market on it. They know the distribution, so they have assets. They could kind of get their consumption, but when these things occur, your productivity drifts. There's no asset market on the background of that. And the shock that I'm going to do in a second is going to be an unexpected.
No unemployment insurance, any of.
I don't have a government in the background. What I'm really going to be looking at is we're in a steady state, and then God changes the inflation in an MIT unexpected way. And that's going to be the kind of thing that's going to trace out.
You're going to show the distribution of W minus Z.
Yep, I'm going to show you that. I'm going to do one thing first. I'm going to tell you how to calibrate the model quickly, and then I'm going to show you kind of the patterns of the results, and I'm going to try to do a few more things before we conclude. So I'm going to just calibrate, as I already told you, on all the labor market flows from workers of different types in the pre-period, match the wage distributions and the flows. Probably not for time going to talk about it, but I am going to look at E to E flows by different parts of the distribution of wage distribution. I'm going to look at U to E flows at different parts of the distribution. This is going to be informative about some of the heterogeneity in the model. And so the fact that high income people are going to churn less, our model is going to infer that is it's going to be costly to post vacancies for these types of workers, and that's why they're churning less. The fact that the U to E doesn't decline despite that, it's because at the same time on the U to E, workers at the bottom of the distribution are going to have more of a preference for unemployment than people at the top. And so those two forces are going to help pin down those fee parameters, which are going to give us churn in the model, as John kind of forecasted early on. Yeah.
What inflation did you feed in for the simulation?
So let's now get to the part. So that's, everybody wants to get here, so let's get here now. So let's talk about what I'm going to do with the model afterwards. So I'm going to do two things, okay? The first one is I'm going to assume at time zero, we're in steady state. God comes down and gives us a 13% on inflation rate. And I'm going to trace out the dynamics of the model. That's not the real world, but it allows me to get the dynamics of the model from the one-time shock, just to kind of see how the dynamics of the model are separate from the dynamics of the inflation. The second experiment I'm going to do is kind of another extreme, where, again, a one-time temporary change in inflation, a one-time change in the price level, and then everything goes back to, in the model, a 2% inflation rate after that. Then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have the agents in the model get unexpected shocks to inflation that match the data in every period. So I go on to a Tuesday and I say, oh, the inflation rate was 3% this year. And then I'm thinking it's going to be back to 2% tomorrow. And then I get to tomorrow and then, oh, it's 4% tomorrow. And I'm going to think it's going to be 2% the next day after. So a series of unexpected MIT shocks, all of these temporary. Going through. So those are the two things. And that's going to allow me to match the time series much better than I'm going to do with this one-time shock. So the one-time shock is going to allow us to learn about the dynamics and then the second one of the model, and then the second one is going to match more of the actual data that I'm going to show you.
The model's continuous time though, so how did you do the shocks periodically?
Yeah, you're basically you would kind of average over what looks like a month in the model, and that's where it's going to be, and we're going to try to do it exactly that way. So this is Josh's question. I told you it was coming. So the green is going to be the distribution of those wage markdowns prior to the inflation shock. And you can see that as a bounded support shock, Josh, for exactly the same reason. There's these endogenous flows. If your basically wage ever gets too high relative to your productivity on the green side, firms are just going to fire you. Okay? You're too expensive. If the wage ever gets too low relative to your productivity, you're just going to quit. And so those are going to be bounded distributions. And again, from those figures that I skipped over, there's a set under which these decisions are made.
This is the one-time price level?
This is a one-time price level shock.
And do we wait some time to get back to steady state?
Yeah, I'm going to show you all of those. This is on impact. I'm sorry, the blue is right after impact. This is just Josh on impact. This is Josh's conjecture from early on. A 13% inflation rate is going to move all of our wages down by 13%. But notice we move a lot from the layoff margin now. And so this is going to generate a big decline in layoffs in the model. So let me kind of show you now what's going to happen to the flows in response to this one-time shock. So on impact of this one-time shock, you're going to get a whole bunch of churn occurring in the labor market. People are going to start looking for another job in response to the inflation, and that's going to eventually atrophy over time. So you're going to get a lot of stuff occurring up front, and then it's going to take time to get back down to steady state. The vacancy to unemployment rate is going to jump with a little bit of a lag, because on impact, some of the low income people, when the wage, real wage fell, quit to unemployment. So you did get a spike in vacancies going up and a spike in unemployment. So there was a little bit of muted thing. That unemployment thing is very temporary. Those workers get reabsorbed back. And so you get a little shifted dynamic, but you get a shift in the vacancy to unemployment rate, and then it kind of comes back down afterwards. And you can see the churn that we're getting in this calibrated model, the E to E flow, isn't that different than kind of what you see in the quit rate that we're observing in the data. So these magnitudes, even though it's a one-time shock, aren't that far out of line what you see in the data. I don't want to take this too quantitatively because it is a different shock, but it is in the magnitudes that we are seeing in the data.
Even the shift in the wage markdown distribution, there must be something in the model that's preventing the E to E rate from going up a lot more. Because there's a lot of people who just got hit with a big negative real wage shock that makes their wage markdown so very large for them now. Why aren't you getting in the model from this experiment bigger rise in E?
So there's going to be like two different reasons, I think, some of which is Pete alluded to earlier. Some people are going to be moving back into their ranges. So that when they,
I understand.
Yeah. And the second thing is you get some stuff for free. And then the third thing is some of us are going to draw renegotiation costs that are relatively low that we don't have to churn to get the real wage increase. So when I show you the real wage movements later on, not all of that is going to come from the churn. Some of it's going to come from our renegotiation on the job, because we just go to your office and I get my office from Stanford. I come back.
These are hard things to observe.
Yeah.
And they're playing a big role in these adjustment dynamics, as I understand.
Exactly. So the thing is that disciplining him is the wage distribution in the pre-period. Given that wage distribution in the pre-period,
it's an indirect
exactly,
because we're not observing the opportunity to renegotiate in any direct way.
Exactly. But what you can see is the wage change of job stayers and how that evolves. And I'm going to show you that in a few minutes. And we're going to see how our model does on that relative to the data.
Can I ask one more question?
Yep.
Don't vacancy durations go down
in this one,
in this experiment? But they
no, they go up in our experiment.
Why is that?
Composition effect. Because now so Steve saying, so the vacancy duration in the data has gone up. Okay, so we see vacancy staying open longer using your method. And then in our model, we actually match that as well, but it's coming from the people when they're unemployed find a vacancy relatively quick. The E to E people find a vacancy a little bit lower. They're just moving on in normal times in their churn on the job ladder. So Steve's right, the E to E people actually find jobs quicker now. But the shift from U to E churn to E to E churn is so large during this period that the composition effect that moves the whole duration distribution up in this one because of a composition. But Steve is right. For the E to E people, their duration is going down. Now I can't see that in the data, but I do see the composition shift from U to E to E was large in this period in terms of the searching, and the E to E people through the lens of the model just take longer to search than the U to E. So it's a complete composition fix during this time period. On impact, this is in this large shock, as Josh said, layoff goes to zero immediately after. Everybody moves so far away from that with this big one-time shock that everybody moves away from the layoff margin. So you get a big decline in layoffs on impact.
Productivity effects, or are you not?
Pete's question going on, there's no match-specific capital in the background. So we're not reallocating to better firms or not. I don't have that in the model. The U to E rate doesn't move in this model. Again, some of that's hardwired in because I assumed that the unemployment margin was in real terms. And so nothing was changing on that. And new hires are real. The unemployment margin is real. So nothing is changing on the UE ratio. Here's the wage changes for job changers and the wage changes for job stayers. This is Steve's question. On impact, we're getting a large increase relative to steady state, even for the job stayers. Why? Because they're going to do the renegotiation with their firm. But the job changers in our model are getting exactly even more than that, because by searching, you're able to get to the flexible wages quicker. These, again, magnitudes are roughly the same magnitudes that I showed you. Again, I don't want to take this part of the paper too quantitatively, but I was comforted that they were at least in the same ballpark that we're observing of the magnitudes in the data. This is going to be the frequency of wage increases for job stayers. This is Steve's question one more time, is basically we're just renegotiation quicker during this period. And again, there's some evidence consistent of this. I don't have the ADP data yet, the micro data like I used to. I am in process of trying to regain access to that, because then I could actually measure this moment a lot quicker. But there is some in the Atlanta Fed data. You are seeing the frequency of wage changes go up in that data as well for job stayers. We get a big shift in the beverage curve, just like we see in the data. Why? Because not much is moving on unemployment, and we're getting a huge change in vacancies. So our model is generating a shift in the beverage curve during this time period. There's a little movement in the unemployment rate as people are moving into the unemployment pool, particularly on impact, but those are small relative to the shift in vacancies. Here is the way job search and EDE rates. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I want to show you one more thing before I conclude, is the distribution across the different types of job search and EDE rates. And in the model, the low types, the blue, are searching more and churning more because they're just more elastic in general. And so that's how they're going to get more of the wage changes early on. And that's how we're going to get the wage compression going on in the data. And so I have some pictures on what happens to the wages of the different groups. We could then just, this last picture I'm going to show you on here, and then I'm going to show you one more thing before I conclude. Oh, but let me show you two slides then, and then we'll have a discussion after that. So this is going to be the welfare in 1 month's wage equivalent. So one is loss of 1 month's wages for different income groups run through the lens of our model. I group the Z's into deciles. And so there's 10 points on this, which is going to be the average of the deciles. And the bottom of the distribution is going to get less welfare losses than the top. But everybody's losing roughly a month of income on the background. And this is a chunk. I mean, I just want to make sure, so if the bottom of the distribution is earning, something, I don't know, 25, 30,000, 40,000, whatever that is, 1 month of that is enough to get people up in arms where they would be hating inflation. And the top of the distribution is going to be about 1 month of income there as well. And the level of income is going to be higher. So the level of dollars.
The data showed us that real wages went down by 4%.
So now let's break it, Cheryl's part, let's break it into its components now. So the sum of the four colors are going to then add up to those line that I just showed you. The blue in this is Harold's part, which is how much of that is just due to the real wage decline in general. into a first approximation, it's a chunk of it. I mean, so most of this is the real wage decline on average.
In fact, if you just focus on that, you would get the same number.
You would get roughly the same number, exactly, because the purples and the orange and the greens cancel out. Now, the purple's way too large, and I'll tell you why the purple's way too large in a second in this experiment. We're in the process of doing this now for this series of MIT shocks coming through. But let me just kind of go through. The yellow or the orange is going to be the renegotiation costs. The green, which you can barely see with your eyes, is going to be the search costs. Because there's a lot of churn in the labor market as well, the additional churn that's coming through is there. It is just relatively small the way we parameterize this compared to the renegotiation costs. Now, I should make a comment that some of the renegotiation costs could actually be search costs. I go out and try to get an offer from Stanford to come back and renegotiate with the booth deans. That is a search behavior that will actually look like in the data for the reason Steve said, a renegotiation. So in the way I kind of write it up in the paper, I kind of clump the orange and the green together for the reason you said. I can't really separate the two. All I could really see is the net effect of the costly actions. The purple is the gains you get from moving so far away from the layoff margin. Now, this shock was so big that everybody moved away from the layoff margin. That is very large in the way I parameterize the shock. When I do the series of MIT shocks, that purple thing is much smaller because here, the big shock just took everybody away. Layoffs went to zero in the economy. And so that is kind of a big thing. That is the one thing we're working on, recalibrating this picture for what I'm going to show you next, the series of MIT shocks. Yeah, John.
I can see that a model would tell us about marginal search and renegotiation costs, but I think you could add kind of arbitrary fixed costs to that, which is always the problem of welfare things, is that they don't really pin that down really well.
Yeah, so
there's discrete choices here that reveal something about the fixed costs.
Yes. In the model, the way we've parameterized, the levels and the elasticities are kind of related. And so, yeah, and so that is, yeah, I'm open for thoughts on how we can kind of move around from some of that. But John is right. So we're using the flows in the pre-period that gives us both the levels and the elasticities, and that is going to be important when we do these welfare calculations.
Some discrete choices, like do I search at all?
Yep.
That measures fixed costs.
Yeah, and we get that in the pre-period. So we got some of this, and so we got some of that in the pre-period. Now the question is, I haven't used I do think there's other moments I could be potentially doing to try to pin these elasticities down a little bit more, which I haven't done. Yeah.
I speak as someone who finds search and renegotiation a big pain in the butt.
Yes.
These are pain in the butt costs.
Yes, that's exactly. But Harold's point is, at least in this parameter, it's really the real wage losses that is driving a lot of this action. Now, the green and the yellow is about 20% of the wage loss there, offset by about a 20% of the welfare gain you're getting from the decline in the layoff margin. But 20% isn't nothing, but it is. The real wage losses is the predominant source of the.
This picture, I think, also sheds light on a completely different theme. I mean, in Europe, there's more job security, right? I mean, there are all kinds of rules that probably come at the cost of lower wages, right? I mean, the job security gives you the purple stuff, but you get the lower wage. One could probably do a comparison.
That would be a different context. Exactly. Use the same kind of framework to go to that kind of question. I think that would be very interesting. Let me kind of show you now. I'm going to feed in just to get a rough sense of the magnitudes that are kind of coming along. I'm now going to just feed in the actual inflation series. And every time it comes along, it's like an unexpected MIT shock. Again, which is again, the expectations of this is really weird. The truth is somewhere probably in between. People, if they knew the whole path at time t, it would probably look somewhat like the one-time shock, but not completely. There would be some smoothing out in this. This is basically every moment is unexpected coming through. And there,
so that's known as a Simza sequence of shocks. That's how they.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how they calculated their counterfactuals. Is they were repeatedly fooling everybody.
Exactly. This is exactly what this is. This is the other extreme that we've done so far. What was the word?
Simza.
Okay, so I thought you said Simshaw, and I was like, I thought it was like a phrase or something, but it was Sims and a Shaw.
Forecasts throughout this period are perfectly modeled as an AR1 back to 2%.
Yeah.
So you could.
We could feed that in. And so that's another thing that we could do. And so we're working on that, on how we could, try to get some of that expectation through kind of the boundary conditions in the middle. But that is something we're working on now. I told you there was one or two. Oh, I told John it's evolving, because that's the next shock we want to do, is just put in the Fed's forecast at time 0 and kind of go through with that. And
the Fed's forecast at each date if you want.
Well, you could do that, but I was just thinking even the one time, the Fed's forecast at that kind of gives you the upper bound on that. But the key thing is we match the time patterns and the magnitudes a little bit better in terms of the data from these kind of series of repeated shocks as opposed to the one-time shock. And then you can see that in EDE flows. We're basically matching the data pretty closely. We went for something like 2.2 to 2.5 in kind of the EDE flows that we're seeing in the data. Here we're going from 2.2 or 2.1 to 2.4. So it's in the same kind of ballpark that we're seeing.
It would be nice to see the data line here.
Yeah, no, I thought of it. Yeah, I thought of that this morning when I should have overlaid the data on part of it. We're still getting a lot of action on the layoff margin, even in this model. So the second thing we're doing is smoothing out the layoff margin in the data, because here we're still getting a 50% decline in layoffs, and the data is at about 20%. So we're still over predicting on that. So we're thinking of how to match that moment a little bit more. Okay, let me kind of show two things to kind of end. This is the kind of thing I like. So now I'm going to say, does my model hold any water and other ways? So how do we go back in time? And so this is the vacancy to unemployment rate for US data going back to 1950. There are, I think, 9 periods there where the spike in the, or 8 periods, where the spike in the vacancy to unemployment rate was relatively large compared to the mean. I put triangles on 4 of them and circles on 4 of them. What are those going to be? Well, the circles, oh yeah, I want to do the triangles first. So let's do the triangles first. I flipped the order of this when I did slides last night. Those are periods that look like traditional hot labor market standard beverage curve stories. What do I mean by that? These are periods when the inflation rate was pretty low. The unemployment rate was low, and it was declining as the vacancy to unemployment rate was going up. It looks like you're moving along kind of a beverage curve. So all of these periods had 2 to 4% inflation rates, unemployment rate in the 4 to 5%, and in the pre-period to the spike, the unemployment rate was going down, usually from some number like 6 or 7% during this period. It looks like you're moving along a traditional beverage curve. There are 4 other periods when we would say that the labor market didn't look overly hot during that time period. So these are going to be 1951, 1973, 1979, or right before 73 or 78. There, the unemployment rate was 5 to 7%, and it wasn't declining in the periods prior to the spike in the unemployment, in the vacancy to unemployment rate. But here, the inflation rate was relatively high and rising during this time period. So you're seeing, 1974, 1979 were periods of high vacancy to unemployment rate, but nobody would really say that was kind of a hot labor market during that period, at least by unemployment dynamics. So what if I just projected the vacancy to unemployment rate on the unemployment rate, kind of trace out the beverage curve? Take the inflation rate and project it on the unemployment rate, take the residuals of that, and just correlate the residuals together. You could see that in periods of high inflation relative to the unemployment rate, were also periods of high vacancy to unemployment rate relative to the unemployment rate. So it seems something about the nature of unemployment, the vacancy to unemployment rate seems to positively be co-varying with the inflation in the economy. And I have regressions in the paper. And then instead of doing the vacancy to unemployment rate, I just show you the vacancy rate as well. You get very similar patterns. So vacancies seem to be going up. Eventually, I want to get EDE flows. So I'll talk to Steve later. Can I get EDE flows going back to 1950 or 1951? But again, really, because our mechanism is that you're going to get a movement towards EDE flows away from UDE flows. That churn in the labor market is what's causing the vacancy to unemployment rate to go up in periods of high inflation. And so it does seem like there's some this theory is holding a little bit of water in periods, at least on the surface, outside the current inflationary episode. So we end the paper by just feeding in a lot of other shocks into our model and see how well they do along a variety of dimensions. Even though it's complex, it's parsimonious. There's only a couple other things I could shock through the lens of our model. So I could shock productivity in the economy. I could shock what I'm going to call labor demand. These are going to be things that are going to be able to move around firm hiring decisions. So the cost of job vacancy posting, maybe the discount rate in the model, getting firms to potentially hire a little bit earlier. And I could shock around the taste for leisure. Through the lens of the model, I'm going to calibrate those shocks so they all match the same vacancy to unemployment rate ex ante. So I'm going to get the shocks to match the rise in the vacancy unemployment rate according to our baseline model. So all of them match the vacancy to unemployment rate by the same magnitude by design. What happens to all of the other mechanisms in the model? And you can see it is hard for these other shocks to get the relatively large increase in EDE flows relative to UDE flows. It is hard for them to get real wages falling because most of these shocks are positive labor market shocks to raise the vacancy to unemployment rate, which usually mean wages go up. Either labor demand goes up or labor supply goes down, both of which put upward pressure on real wages. So those are going to struggle to match the real wage declines. You can see that the wage growth of switchers relative to stayers is always higher because that's what we calibrate the stitchers being. But the change during this period is much higher in our model in terms of the getting the wage growth of the switchers relative to stayers in any of these other models. So these other models kind of struggle with what we'll call pure labor market shocks to kind of match jointly the flows where our model is pretty successful on that dimension. And so this is my last slide, which begs the question, you know, what caused inflation to go up during this period and how would that potentially interact with the labor market? Well, if there's the literature has two types of stories that are going on, a negative supply shock and maybe a positive demand shock. A negative supply shock puts downward pressure on the vacancy to unemployment rate, puts downward pressure on real wages, puts downward pressure on the UDE rate, causes employment to fall. A positive, you know, we'll call labor demand shock, something like government spending or things of those natures, does the opposite. And if those both things happened at the same time, it's possible that those things, you know, the true effects of those things on the labor market roughly offset, and you might be left with the inflation things. The point on with this part is these other shocks that people are telling have offsetting effects on the labor market. And so you need a different type of exercise to try to infer what the causes of the inflation were through the lens of our model. But it's possible that if these things had roughly offsetting forces, our inflation shock could be a driver that is explaining a lot of the inflation, the labor market dynamics during this period. Let me go Josh first.
What about a work from home shock that happened at the same time? I mean, all of a sudden, if your commuting costs go to zero, then that might explain. You said that
take one thing with it more with that. Okay. So suppose it's an amenity now. So like basically you're going to commuting costs go down in some sectors, and I want to move to those sectors potentially because I like working from home and you don't. So that's going to generate some churn. But in that model, the wage growth of the job switchers would actually be lower than it would be because I'm going to compensate some in the amenity. So for that one, the wage growth of the switchers is going to hard to generate in those models of work from home as being a primary shock. Now it could do good on other margins. It could get the average wages going down. It could get some churn, but getting the wage growth of the switchers versus stayers, those models would potentially struggle with.
That's under the assumption of flexibility wages for switchers, but not for stay.
Yeah, under the lens of the model I wrote down. And then we might say that you might not want that model written down, but if you wanted to have that model, that would be Bob.
As somewhat of a student of this topic, implicit comparison going in here between a relatively straightforward New Keynesian model, that's kind of the starting point. And then a critique of that model because it doesn't fit a lot of the things that you've brought in data, which we don't normally, New Keynesian model. So then you could say, here's what the New Keynesian model gets wrong, which is fixed by this.
I don't have a lot of other features in it. I took one element of the New Keynesian model, sticky wages, and put it in a standard search model. So it's a search model with New Keynesian. If I wanted to have that critique of the New Keynesian model, I think I'm going to need a few more bells and whistles that I don't have But I do think there are things that those new Keynesian models would have predictions about, like the wage changes of switchers versus stayers, that they might fail to match in some of their models. But I have not written that model. So I've started with a search model with one new Keynesian feature, as opposed to a new Keynesian model and then putting in a couple of search features. So
okay, well then you could start. That's a legitimate starting point.
that's what I thought where I was starting. And so given that, through the lens of my model, these other shocks would struggle to match some of the patterns that I've showed you. Thank you. I'm out.